Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I know that you all have very busy schedules and you could be choosing to do something else. So thank you for being a part of this. So many of you will already know, as following our series, perhaps watching our previous webinars and receiving some of the articles, that generative AI engine optimization is very important. And there are lots of ways in which we need to ensure we build our visibility in that space to meet our audience needs and to meet them along the journey. But we want to talk today about thinking about how to grasp competitive advantage. And to me, that's about systemizing the approach and making sure that generative AI engine optimization is baked into our operational model in a way which is going to ensure that we make great progress as user behavior changes. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in and talk about that. So today, we're going to talk about why generative AI engine optimization matters. And I think if you've joined today, you probably already know that, but let's quantify it together. Then I'm going to talk about how capabilities within organizations really change behavior and how it's so important to build capabilities documentation, as well as inspiring people through training. We're then going to talk a bit about how platforms and process deliver change, and I'll talk through some of the suggestions that we have in ways that you might want to centralize this approach to create greater impact. And finally, we're going to talk about evidence that this works and talk about a client who has built a very centralized perspective on GEO and the results that has garnered for them. So firstly, I mentioned that answer engine optimization matters, and the numbers are just getting staggering in this respect because over 5% of all ChatGPT messages globally are about healthcare, which is a staggering number when you consider that actually ChatGPT now has more than 1 billion users per month. So this is a very serious channel that we have to consider because of the rapid growth that we're seeing. And that's just ChatGPT, let alone all the other LLMs who obviously have huge audience numbers as well. Over 40 million prompts are actually delivered about healthcare every single day. So that's the size of the opportunity that we see in front of us. And this is further supported by the fact that in more qualitative research, 31% of US consumers state that they're already using generative AI for healthcare information. So this symbiotic relationship between using search as it used to be, using answer engines and speaking to your physician is happening. This is how the journey occurs between research, which is done independently by patients, conversations with healthcare professionals, further follow-up and research. And we have to consider that as a vital part of the journey. And 28% of UK GPs are also reportedly using AI tools in clinical practice. So it's not just patients, it's also healthcare professionals. And I could have picked a number of different statistics from different markets which indicate exactly the same thing. Now, when I looked at these statistics, one of the questions that I had was, okay, but is this GPs using healthcare specific LLMs, which have been designed for their use? Or is this them picking up ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever their platform of choice is? And what I discovered when digging a bit deeper into the data is that 13% of healthcare professionals in the UK are reporting using ChatGPT in their clinical practice. So that just hopefully gives you a little bit of an idea about the propensity of this and the need for change. Now, one of the worrying bits of news, if you're heavily reliant on organic search traffic, which many of our clients are, having dedicated lots of resources to building their organic search visibility, is that by 2028, it is reported that organic search traffic will decrease by 50%. That's actually quite a staggering number, especially when you consider all the investment that we put into making sure that our content is visible. As this behavior changes, we must be there front and center, which is why it's important to systemize GEO and get competitive advantage now as this change takes place. So to meet the challenge, healthcare organizations need to embed answer engine optimization into operational model. Now, you may be familiar with some of the challenges which come up with doing this, and that is that often content strategy is developed independently from discoverability teams or SEO teams who are now obviously taking a keen interest in GEO. So content strategy will be maybe worked on between the brand and a creative AOR, who are obviously very good at creative, but not necessarily baking in generative AI engine optimization from the outset. So it's happening independently over here before optimization occurs with an SEO team further down the track. That actually we have to join these two things together if we're to be successful, and I'm hopefully going to demonstrate why that is. So there needs to be a change in the way that these teams work together in order to make that really optimal. The other thing is that measurement frameworks are going to have to change, because right now we could be measuring organic search traffic, we could be measuring our rankings and visibility, and we could, of course, be measuring our engagement and indeed high value actions which come out of organic search traffic. And what we might see over the next few years is a line going down as less and less people are using search engines. So what we must do is make sure that we change at a sort of systemic central level the way that we measure and the platforms that we measure with, to make sure that as we see our organic search behavior change and our organic search results change, that we understand how our AI visibility is changing to make sure it's offsetting any loss in organic performance. Now, of course, brands can and do work on this independently, and we work with many of them where brands are really getting to grips with their organic strategy being about SEO and GEO simultaneously and working through the stages of doing that. Now, we did have a presentation which unpacks this in great detail, which we'll share a link to when we share this one with you as well. But to talk through some of the basics, we first need to understand audience goals. And of course, brands can look at their keyword research and social listening to blend both a quantitative and qualitative view of the data to build out audience needs, and then align those to first and third party data to really pull through audience insights. So we can ultimately answer the question, what do audiences want and how can we best meet their needs as they align to our brand goals? The second is really around the landscape, and we can do competitive analysis and benchmarking and ensure that we're really getting a good understanding at a brand level and indeed at an organizational level. So I'll go on to explain in a little while how we're performing versus our competitors. And again, we actually have an article that we've written about the importance of benchmarking and how to approach it. So we can share a link to that too when we send out the assets that will come at the end of this presentation. And of course, we can look on a site-by-site basis, if that's what you have, if you have individual brand sites rather than a portal setup, at your technical setup and also a content audit to make sure that we understand the likelihood of AI retrieval and of course the quality of the content versus the audience goals that we've identified. And then brands can have an independent content and geo strategy, offsite strategy, and measurement and optimization. And we saw this, if I take you back 10 years to when I was working with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and other life sciences businesses on SEO optimization, and some brands were early adopters and they would be working on their website independently. And then what happened over time is that capabilities built and organizations started to develop a centralized view of organic search. And it became a fact that no website went live without a particular process being followed to ensure that organic search was really being captured. And really, that's the whole premise of what I'm saying today, which is that yes, we could wait brand by brand for them to do that. But in order to really grab the moment and make sure we have competitive advantage, we should operationalize now and then make sure that we're well ahead of the game as this change continues to accelerate. So how should organizations systemize GEO to gain competitive advantage? I think it starts with organizational goals. So of course, what we're going to do is set some reasonably generic but ambitious goals right at the top. And those goals must be built in a way which is adaptable to the nuance of each of the brands. So we start with this sort of central vision of what we want to achieve, and then we adapt it into each of the brand plans. Then we're going to look at capabilities and governance and how we can make sure we embed greater knowledge and inspiration, as well as capabilities documentation to ensure that a process is followed to deliver business impact. And we'll look at audience and query intelligence and how that can be centralized and standardized to make sure that we're delivering the right insights to drive our GEO strategy, as well as looking at content and information architecture through the lens of ensuring that our CMS is capable of delivering the kind of formats which are going to lead to GEO success. And then we'll talk about Offsite and how we need to ensure that our current channel activities are feeding into our overall generative AI success. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about measurement and optimization. So starting with organizational goals, we might look at this first, in a very kind of generalized way, at an organizational level, we need to increase organic visibility. And of course, there's a purpose to that. So we need to increase organic visibility of our brands in order to help patients understand the options that are available to them if we're one kind of business, or maybe we're looking at increasing organic visibility to make sure we're able to meet patients with content around therapy area, which is going to help drive the conversation in our relationship and improve patient outcomes. And we may have others in terms of healthcare professionals, of course. But ultimately, we might want to increase our organic visibility, meaning, yes, we want to maintain our search share of voice as best we can. And also we want to simultaneously build our LLM share of voice over the period. So once we've got those core goals and we've set them versus our current situation, we can then take it to a brand specific level. So we say to everybody in the organization, right, this is our goal. We've got to build visibility in this space. But of course, each of the brands will have to adapt that to the point in the journey that they need to build visibility in order to align to their brand goals and drive the results that the business needs. So once we've done that and we've set our goals, I think the first step is to look at capabilities and governance. And again, going back to my experience, where we have worked with organizations across really embedding search engine optimization, we started with very clear training, which we delivered to build capabilities and show people some of the basics. Over the course of 2 hours, you don't necessarily make somebody an organic search expert, but you can definitely provide a lot of the basics which help them to manage the process with agency partners. But I think as importantly, if not more importantly, is that training gives a great opportunity to inspire people around the opportunity. So if you can start off by saying, look, this is the scale of the opportunity, this is what's happening in the landscape and the shift in behavior, then they leave that training with an imperative to do something about it. And that drives organizational change. So that's one of the areas that we really want to make sure we're hitting home in this capabilities training. But then understanding how generative engines influence patient and ATP journeys so that we can understand how to take advantage of it. Identifying GEO opportunities by building insight out of data, and applying GEO best practices to content planning and then ultimately production, as well as really understanding how Offsite plays a pivotal role in delivering your AI success and how your current channel activity can be adapted in order to deliver that outcome. And then looking at measuring and interpreting performance of this new channel. So there's some of the areas that I would recommend building capabilities around within your organization in order to deliver the outcome that you're looking for. And then, of course, providing clear documentation. So if we can provide really useful step-by-step guidance across the entire process, then it means that anybody working on a website and delivering web content, or indeed their channel plan, will be able to follow that step by step. So it's helpful. And it also means that we can hold our teams accountable to a best practice which needs to be delivered against. And really importantly, those teams can then share that with their agencies and make sure that agencies are also delivering against those standards. So all in all boats hopefully rise with the tide as long as everybody is following that really concrete and helpful guidance which we can provide. One of the things which is really important to deliver within that guidance is checklists, so that when a brand manager or any other individual within the organization is working with an agency partner, they can very easily go to that checklist and talk through each of those points so that they can ensure that all of those areas have been delivered against without necessarily working their way through the entire playbook. And then setting up measurement standards. So we need to adapt ultimately the global measurement framework, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, to ensure that everybody is measuring in a consistent way so we can understand relative performance. And then finally, working with MLR in the first instance to ensure we build guardrails, which they agree with, understand, and sign off on, really helps to speed up the process when we get to a compliance process and getting things signed off, because everybody understands what they're talking about and everybody understands what good looks like, and it just saves an awful lot of toing and froing. So MLR guidelines are a really important thing to establish within your organization to make sure you can be speedy, get to market quickly. Now, I also think it's really important to centralize your data that you're going to be using in your organic strategy moving forward. So one of the things is keyword research. Now, this is a thing we've been talking about for years, right? And I know from personal experience that there are bits of keyword research in Excel spreadsheets scattered all over organizations. And it's really important to bring all of that together into a cloud-based system. And the reason for that is because, one, you have this centralized point where you keep adding to and refining to understand the overall search and ultimately geo opportunity in the way that I'll explain in a moment. And once you've got it centralized and you can see all of your keyword research there and everybody can see it all there, you can also do a standardized approach to the categorization of that keyword research so that everybody is able to see that you can understand what might be healthcare professional search, what might be patient search, what might be a series of categories that make sense consistently and subcategories that make sense consistently. And then you can also split it over each of the journey stages. So for a patient, you might be thinking about symptoms and then diagnosis and then treatment and then aftercare and adherence. And so if you do it consistently all of the time into your centralized database, you end up with a really rich and useful way of looking at your data that can really drive your content strategy forward. Then really having a social listening service, which is well signposted and dashboards set up, but also the raw data that allows people to extract the semantically relevant long form conversations and questions for geo is also really important. So setting that up in a centralized way and then making sure that people are signposted to it and that within your best practice documentation are asked to review that as part of the content planning process, I think really drives things forward from a geo perspective, but also simply from a meeting audience needs perspective. And then finally, a really well-structured library of your first and third-party audience data really means that you get a lot of value out of what is very expensive to produce and make sure that it's all in the same place and easy to find. So once you've done that, you can establish a standard approach for data synthesization for each of your teams. So you'll be able to say, look, when you're thinking about generative AI engine optimization and you're thinking about your content, you need to look at the long tail phrases, especially questions within that keyword research, as a proxy for what prompts people might be entering into LLMs like ChatGPT. And then they can examine journey stages and categories because the keyword research will always be done in a standardized way. And so they'll be able to extract, based on what their goal is, the specific keyword portfolios which are relevant to the content that they're trying to produce, either at a category level or at a journey stage level. And then they can blend the social listening insights, which are specific to any of those categories. So you're able to then say, okay, from my raw data within this social listening, what can I extract in terms of questions that might be useful at each journey stage? And finally, then look at it through the lens of your first and third party data to see what else it tells you about audiences and how you can make it work. But the centralized data makes this really easy to enforce and means you can drive value. And then we have to think about our content and information architecture. And we will talk in a minute about what a good page looks like from a geo perspective. But in the end, in order to achieve that, you need to make sure your CMS is capable of it. So again, from a centralized perspective, this is where we have to start talking to our development team. And we need to say to them, look, is our CMS capable of delivering the best possible schema that we need in order to optimize for geo and organic search, honestly? And do we have the page templates which are going to allow us to structure our content in the right way? So we then need to look at our planning approach and make sure that we're adapting it in a way which is going to be in line with geo best practice. So do we have internal content production, and do those teams through that process have a way of making sure that things are optimized around a question and answer based content structure, for example? And then, as I mentioned before, co-creating compliance guidelines will really help you to move this along more quickly. And then once you've got that process, so, okay, I know my CMS works, I know that I've adapted my planning approach, I know I've got the templates which are available within my CMS or global design system to support geo-optimization. I know I've got the compliance guardrails in place, then we can roll it out to internal stakeholders and agency partners and make sure that they understand how to use those templates and that CMS and global design system to full effect. Now, it's just interesting to point out that, of course, I'm here telling you that content structure is incredibly important to your LLM retrieval. So in other words, if an LLM likes the way your content looks, it's more likely to retrieve it. But I did want to back that up with some important data. And this comes from a study called When Content is Goliath and Our Algorithm is David, which was created by a number of universities across the US and China working together, where they explored 10,000 websites, and they ultimately compared the relationship between organic rankings and whether you appeared in a Google AI generated response. And what they found was that they don't exactly correlate. So it's not like I've got great SEO rankings and therefore I definitely appear in this AI response. What they actually found was that one of the things which is very, very important is having a predictable, clearly structured and semantically similar structure of that content, which is the same as LLMs. So in the end, it firmly and categorically showed that content format and semantic clarity strongly influence LLM visibility. So your CMS and your approach to content production does need to align to that, or else you're going to be behind your competitors. So what does that look like? I have shared this before in a previous webinar, but I'm going to go through it again because it's really important. Because we firstly need to make sure we're using the most common questions related to a topic. So how do I live a long and healthy life is the one that I've used as an example here because I think it's a topic we definitely all probably think about. And then we need to use varied formats to enhance content discoverability. And what we've found through benchmarking is that YouTube video is very important for your LLM visibility, but I'll come on to that in more detail. So we also need a key facts block, which if somebody is asking this question in an LLM, the LLM is very likely to use that key facts block as part of its answer. So it's really important to have that. Then we're going to make sure that we map really closely what our internal links should be. So you can see here, I've provided one in here, and internal links are very, very important. We should provide clear headings to all of our content. We should consider the content format like bullets for easy comprehension. We need to ensure that we really well reference our content. And as I mentioned before, our structured data markup needs to be really good. And so our CMS needs to allow for this. So the point that I'm really making is, yes, this is really important and you should do this with your content. But if you really want to drive change, you've first got to make sure that your CMS is set up to allow people to do this in the right way. So the next thing I want to talk about is offsite strategy in GEO. Offsite is incredibly important because ultimately, if your on-site content tells a certain story against a series of audience needs, then your offsite authority proves it. So it really helps to say, I've got this really great content which I've developed on my website, but how can I make sure that when an LLM is out there and looking, there's plenty of sources that verify that what I'm saying is right. So ultimately, it matters because it strengthens our authority signals, and the higher our authority signals, the more likely an LLM is to trust our content and use it, which is really important. It also reinforces entity relationships. And what I mean by that is that when an LLM is out there in the world collecting information from all the different places that it does, it wants to understand the relationship between certain entities. And an entity could be a company. So let's take company X and then say, right, so that's one entity. Then underneath that level, we have a brand. So we might have a medical brand or a medical device or a supplement or whatever it might be. And they know that that company sells that brand. And then underneath that, there might be a therapy area. So this company sells this brand, which treats this therapy area. And all the different offsite bits and pieces and structured data that they're able to pull from everywhere helps them to reinforce and understand those entities. That's one of the things. And believe me, we've looked at big healthcare organizations where LLMs don't always join the dots effectively because that is not quite optimal and in the way that it should be. And of course, Offsite also expands your content reach. And so it can place your content on authoritative sources, which might also be used to pull into an LLM response. So even if it's not you that's delivering the message that you're trying to deliver is being delivered by a third party. And of course, that's in many ways just as good. So in order to take this forward, we first need to identify channel usage now. So take a really close look at who's doing what across each of the channels. And some of those that are really important from an LLM perspective are YouTube, Reddit, LinkedIn, and of course other third-party publications like NIH or scientific journals or whatever it might be. Now, I mentioned earlier that when we were looking at benchmark reports across a range of clients, we did see that YouTube featured very heavily. So if you've currently got YouTube content, which is on the second biggest search engine because it's out there on YouTube, then really make sure that it's connected and the relationship between your website and that content is understood by the LLM. Make sure that you have really optimized that content to ensure that it has the greatest reach that it possibly can. And you will find that it gets pulled into answers and gets cited within LLM experiences. So really important to join those things together. And then same for Reddit, it's a very, very popular channel for LLMs to pull from, as well as LinkedIn. And that does vary by LLM slightly. But it's definitely important when we think about our content. Where could our content go is a great question, which would help to build citation. And where can we get the maximum reach across that is really important. So understanding the current approach to channel planning and then making sure that we intersect with each of the stakeholders along that path, whether it be corporate comms, whether it be our social media team, and ensuring that we optimize each of those assets to appear in LLMs as well, will massively increase our reach. Now, the next thing to talk about is the technical foundations for AI discoverability. And really, this needs to be part of the launch readiness requirements, which your development team would be going through. So I'm sure you've already got in place that when a website's about to go live, there's all sorts of checks that are done. Of course, there's UAT and there's do the analytics work. And hopefully there's also some organic search elements which are being considered. But there are some things which are a bit different for Geo. So we need to talk to that central team and make sure that they do understand each of those things and it becomes part of how they assess websites before they go live. So there are some things that we need to understand, for example, about the robots.txt file and making sure that AI crawlers are able to access your content. There's lots of things which have crossover with organic search, like your site structure and internal linking, as well as things like indexation signals, be it your sitemap accessibility or canonicals or optimizing your metadata. But then there is also specifics, again, in terms of things like JavaScript rendering, which Google, for example, can handle very well. They can read that content and they can understand it. An LLM cannot understand it. And so we need to make sure that we understand all those things collectively as a team so that we resolve any technical issues on your platform to make sure you're ready for an AI universe. And finally, we need to make sure we're looking at measurement and understanding our current measurement framework. And often you might have a centralized measurement framework, which each of the brands or parts of your organization is looking to use and to adapt into their own set of goals. And so we need to look at that and make sure that LLM success is being measured in the right way. Then we need to look at the existing reporting and dashboard setup and making sure that those dashboards are matching what it is that we've placed into the measurement framework. But firstly, we'll have to establish a measurement platform for Geo. So it might be that you have a platform that already would measure LLMs if you set it up. And I'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. Or it might be that you need to procure a brand new platform to hold at a central level so you can track your performance ongoing. And then we can adapt all of those things to make sure we're really understanding how we're doing across the Geo landscape. I mentioned I'd talk about a couple of platforms, so here are some. We've got the SEMrush, for example, which is a great platform that you might be using at a central level already. Great for quickly pulling AI overview performance, and you can have a look at yours next to your competitors in terms of AI overview visibility, which is really useful. And we've tested a number of these platforms, but Omni is another one which really goes deep into LLM tracking and gives in-depth citation analysis. And it really allows you to segment the data in a way that gives you a lot more clarity around where you might want to focus your attention and your strategy. Or you could be using something like AccuLLM, which is part of AccuRanker, which will also provide sentiment analysis of the responses, which can be really interesting. And also allows you to look at your SEO performance and your LLM performance side by side. So you start to understand the symbiotic relationship, which is incredibly important and we found very useful. So before we conclude, I've said a lot about how we should centralize our process. So let's find out whether it works or not. Working with a leading life sciences company, we really took a highly centralized approach to them rolling out some key areas around ensuring they were performing better in Geo. And I'll talk you quickly through what they did. So they started with an AI visibility benchmark, and it started out with AI overviews first and really getting an understanding of that. And then as the world changed and we started to have more access to LLM visibility, we then went through and measured that against hundreds of prompts across brand, non-brand, and HCP and patient queries. which really told us where we had visibility in AI answers and importantly, where we did not. It was able to show us top-cited competitors, which allowed for greater analysis of why they were beating us, frankly, and then gaps between audience needs and existing content. And then from there, we went through a technical exercise, but the point is that this was a global portal. So we weren't sort of fixing a brand website over here and then seeing some results. We were fixing it in its entirety at a CMS level. So looking at things like site speed, looking at things like tailored metadata to conversational queries or questions, and then looking at ways that we could format content. So firstly, the CMS had to do it, and then we were able to go through and look at opportunities to restructure content. And then a site-wide, by that I mean global, in every region on this one portal around the world, looking at schema audit and update to ensure that we were delivering the right level of value. And from there, we saw massive increases in performance. So you can see here, we had a 30% increase in share of available AI overviews, which was massive over the course of the year, and an increase in LLM referral traffic across the year, which is really quite significant. Now, of course, we don't see huge levels of referral traffic from LLMs, although they are incredibly valuable users. In fact, research says that an LLM visitor is 4.4 times more likely to deliver a high value action than somebody coming through organic search. So they are important visitors, but what it does is provide you with really great trend data, because what you can see at the beginning of the year is there wasn't much, and at the end of the year, there was 5 times as much, which really tells you that you've probably got 5 times more LLM visibility, which is obviously really a wonderful thing. So yes, it does work, and doing it from a central perspective really leads to some great results. I hope everybody found this to be interesting and informative, and it gave you some good food for thought about how to drive your organisation forward. I'm thrilled for your attendance. I truly appreciate it. And we will send out a follow-up to this, which will have a series of resources on it, which I hope you find really useful. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.